Welcome to the second episode of Noble's Sustainability Stories, where we tell the stories of Noble's graduates who work in a variety of fields. Today, we are welcoming Lucy Lyons from the class of 2015. Lucy has had quite an interesting career in climate tech, including a stint in sustainable death care. She's going to tell us about that, as well as her current work and her master's at Oxford. Welcome, Lucy.
Thank you so much for having me, Kate. This is really exciting.
Yeah, we're glad to have you here. So, before we get into your professional career, were there any things at Nobles that inspired you to get into sustainability professionally?
Sure, went on the farm and food systems trip my freshman year, got me thinking a lot about the behind the scenes nature of the sustainability problem in the food we eat and everything. And of course, Deb Harrison's AP Environmental class definitely got me thinking about some of these things.
Oh, yeah, that sustainability trip, the farm and food trip, is actually happening this June. So, maybe some other current Noble students will be inspired from that. After NYU, you had quite an interesting, as I mentioned, professional experience over in Europe. Can you walk us through that?
Sure. So like many college grads, upon graduation, knew that I wanted to do something impactful, but I didn't know exactly what that would look like. So I basically made the decision to take this time in my life and move to a new country. I really just wanted to build on the German language skills that I had built in kind of my time studying abroad. I'd been abroad in Berlin my junior year of college. And I thought, if anything, living and working in a new country will teach me how to be more independent, how to be more resourceful, and I'm sure it'll be fun. So I moved to Berlin in the middle of 2019 with that in mind. Not easy to find work in a foreign country when you're not native in the language and you've never lived there before and you don't have a network. So I worked pretty hard to find the opportunity that I ended up finding, but it was actually fantastic. So I was introduced to someone who was basically incubating startups out of his brand studio in Berlin. And he said, hey, I'm working on a couple projects, looking to hire some people, really early stage. What do you think of this one? I want to build a company called reLive. And what reLive will do is build a death care revolution, a sustainable death care revolution, by turning people's remains into memorial trees. So the whole vision was we are going to replace graveyards dedicated to death with forests dedicated to life. So I thought this sounded really cool and revolutionary. And I was like, this is way more amazing than anything I could have hoped for, especially given how hard it was to find a job. So I moved over to Berlin and on my first day of work, found out that I was actually the only one building this company. So the guy who was funding me basically jetted off to Paris, had some other things to do, and said, all right, in a month, show me the business plan, show me the P&L, and let's get this thing started. So for the better part of a year, I basically took an MBA crash course. I did market research. I figured out how to forge partnerships. I, did a classic business model canvas and got all the way to the point where I was fundraising for this venture. And, in this process, COVID also hit. So things were complicated. It didn't end up working out, but it was an amazing experience and taught me, climate tech and reinventing the wheel, reinventing old industries, that is, to be more sustainable, is fascinating. And it's what I want to do.
Yeah, so climate tech, tell me a little bit more about that term. For those of us who are new to some of these ideas, can you help us better understand that idea of climate tech?
Yeah, so I will backtrack a little bit and say that it was no coincidence that this guy wanted to incubate this startup in Berlin. Berlin is a climate tech hub of sorts. It's a place where there are lots of sustainable startups cropping up. And to go back to your original question, what is climate tech? Well, the way that I like to think about it is that decarbonization is a massive problem. And within the problem, there are a subset of smaller problems, and all those smaller problems have to have solutions. And, when you're thinking about building a startup, it's always about identifying problems and formulating a product that is going to solve that problem. So climate tech is really a constellation of solutions that are going to get us to net zero. So there's hardware solutions, which could be an IoT, so an Internet of Things sensor device that would track methane emissions on an oil rig. Whereas a software solution could be the dashboard that shows you, what are the emissions connected to this device. So that's software and hardware in one company, but they're also just a collection of only hardware companies and only software companies, for just basically in the space. So yeah.
So after reLive, you pivoted to another company that did something a little bit different. Can you tell us about that experience?
Totally. So, as a part of my fundraising journey, so to speak, in Berlin, I met lots of amazing people in this climate tech space. And one of them was a woman who was building a startup that it was a software solution. What it did was help companies calculate, monitor, and reduce carbon emissions. So, what it really was a dashboard where you could see kind of where your emissions hotspots are, and then a suite of recommendations to help you actually reduce those emissions. So we worked with all sorts of companies, big fashion retailers, automotive companies, even financial institutions who wanted to know, okay, what sorts of what is the emissions associated with my investment portfolio. So that really woke me up to this broader problem, which is businesses have no idea how they're going to transition. And they need help first with carbon accounting, so actually understanding what is my carbon footprint, but then actually business model transformation and decarbonization.
Yeah, that's a lot of work to be done in that space. And before we move into your master's at Oxford, if you can just share with us some lessons that you learned from your time in Berlin that might have to do with anyone working in the sustainability space, but maybe would just be helpful to any young grads who are starting their careers.
Definitely. So I think the one thing that was really crystallized for me during my time there was the importance of finding great mentors. And I think I didn't even realize how important this was because I was blessed pretty much my whole life with having fantastic mentors. Starting at Nobles, I had teachers who would take time to have lunch with me and talk not only through my papers, but through my life plans and what I wanted to do and what's important to me. And I lacked that definitely at the beginning of my time in Berlin. And I realized, gosh, I lean so much on fantastic people who've already been through experiences that I'm going through. And I mean, a big takeaway from my time in Berlin was definitely becoming more resourceful, not only building a company, but doing basic things like figuring out how to book a doctor's appointment in a foreign country and how to secure a visa. All these things were difficult, but I became more independent, more scrappy, more resourceful through it. But going kind of, I think one of the great things about being in a more structured environment at the beginning of your career is you can really seek out those mentors. So I think finding great people to learn from and grow with is fantastic, and I look forward to doing that hopefully in the next stage of my career.
And so now you've moved from one European country to another, although without the language barrier.
Without the language barrier, and it's unfortunately not, and it's in Europe, but it's not in the EU, which is something that's talked about a lot here. But yeah, I suppose.
That is true. No, you're absolutely right. But the program at Oxford seems pretty cutting edge just from what you've shared with me and what I've read. Can you tell us about the program and what makes it so unique?
Yeah, so the program's kind of funny because it's almost like a startup in and of itself. It's the first year of the master's. It's new. It's within the Oxford School of Geography and the Environment. What it's called is it's a Master's of Science in Sustainability, Enterprise, and the Environment. And it's very interdisciplinary. It's really looking at this question of how can businesses be incentivized and legislated to lead the net zero transition. So we look a lot at environmental economics. So really, how do you internalize the externalities? I know it's a little bit econ speak, but really what it means is how do we incorporate the social cost of carbon into our capitalist society? And it's looking at this in the context of carbon, but also in terms of nature. And we learn a really cool framework for understanding how countries can quantify their wealth in terms of their natural resources, and not just in terms of GDP. So it's a lot of new economic thinking. But it also looks at fundamentally how can we change businesses. So how can an energy company, or sorry, an oil company become an energy company? How can we transition assets away from gas and towards renewables? And yeah, I mean, you can look at this, of course, in the lens of many different industries, but it's been fascinating, really, and I've been having a great time. I'm kind of sad it's almost coming to an end. It's only a year long, so.
Yeah. So who else is in the program with you? Are there people coming from different backgrounds, or who are you learning alongside?
So I like to say I'm learning probably even more from my classmates than from the actual lecturers. So we're a cohort of 24 people coming from all sorts of disciplines. So I have friends who are mechanical engineers. I have friends who are social scientists. I have friends who have started NGOs for youth climate activism. And really, we're all united around this common goal of help, not helping businesses, but how can we transition the private sector to zero? Um, and so I mean, it's a very social cohort. We spend a lot of time together thinking about problems outside of class. And I really do love my cohort. And I think the most valuable thing about this is that we are going to be working on the same problem as we move forward in our careers. And I really hope that I am working with some of my classmates as I go forward, whether it's right after school or in the future.
So a year long, it's a short time. What are some of the things you're thinking about for the future? What's next for you?
So I just really think there is so much opportunity in helping all of these businesses, which have now set net zero targets. I think you've got about 35% of companies have now said, we are going to get to zero. I want to help these companies get there. So there's a lot of ways that could look. Consulting is one route. There's a lot, even the big management consultancy firms have decarbonization divisions. I would be happy going back and working for another tech company like the one where I was before that's providing software solutions that help businesses decarbonize. And I think ultimately I want to be an entrepreneur again. If I learned anything else from reLive, it's that the process of building a company from scratch is something that really excites me. So I'm looking forward to doing that later on in my career.
Well, Lucy, thank you so much for sharing your professional experience. And I know we're all going to be looking for updates from you as you continue along this path. But we really appreciate your time. And to everyone listening, thank you so much for tuning in to Noble Sustainability Stories.